thanks thanks to Judith and Bidisha and Toma for organizing this event, especially because this is something, as a researcher, we're expected to. Sometimes we are expected to keep a distance from what we study, what we research on. But I think this time, this type of event or this type of theme, it makes it difficult to maintain research. We actually get involved into all these things. Looking at the the first film this morning, it was actually a touching experience. So thank you. So as you can see, I'm presenting Life of Pi, okay, and I always mispronounce it as Life of P. Sometimes I don't know why. So if it happens in the middle, just forgive me for that. Okay, so so I start with a quote in the book itself. When your life is threatened, your sense of empathy is blunted by a terrible, selfish hunger for survival, says Pisin Patel, which is the name of Pi, in the book. The protagonist of Life of Pi, which you can see the book cover. The novel, written by Canadian writer Jan Martel, obtained a Man Booker Prize in 2002 and was made into a motion picture by Angel Lee 10 years later. Okay, so this is the poster. Okay, so I'm not going to deal with the movie, because I'm going to actually deal with the book. But as you can see, the movie has there's a typical Indian boy standing, is as Indian as one can get, with his attires and all these things. And even the boat looks like a bit like a musical instrument. Okay, so so there are many iconographic elements in the poster. So this Odyssey of Pi, as aptly suggests the title of the movie in French. Okay, so this is the poster of the French in French. So revolves around the life of Pi in South India, Pondicherry. His journey on a ship in the Pacific Ocean, so from Pondicherry to Canada, and later on a shipwreck and Pi's survival. The French title thereby provides the movie title. Kind of provides with an incipit of the whole story, as opposed to a somewhat generic connotation given by the English title, which is Life of Pi. So the French title also takes a leaf out of Homer's classic and does justice to the book, as the diegetic time in the novel is full of adventures for Pi. The English title that had life instead of Odyssey insinuates that the whole life of a survivor, and not just the time when he's grappling to survive, is an Odyssey. So, as he would perhaps never cease to live those moments of near death experience that equally translated into the survivor abandoning momentarily his humanity and adopting the animal instinct of survival. So the plot revolves around Pi, his father, his mother, and a brother who run a zoo in Pondicherry. So they actually own a zoo, South India, and they are required to flee the country due to the politics of Indira Gandhi and the imposition of emergency rule in the 70s. So the diegetic time in a novel written in 2002 is mid 70s to late 70s, which carries an intertextual wink with another Indo-Canadian author, Rohinton Mistry, who wrote a novel called Such a Long Journey, published in 1991, where Indira Gandhi's rule, slowly trails a nation suffering with birth pangs to dictatorship. Pi's father decides to leave India and settle down in Canada, and to take his zoo animals along with him. Even though the pretext of fleeing India does not hold water, what follows is a trail of adventures that result in a shipwreck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, resulting in the losses of both animals and human beings, and also resulting in the loss of innocence for 15 years old Pi. Sorry, so he's just 15 years old at the whole time of adventure. The sole human survivor of this shipwreck is Piscine. So his first name is Piscine, as I already told you, which actually means a swimming pool in French. So the sole survival is Piscine and a Bengal and a tiger, and a Bengal tiger, which is like almost like 420 pounds. Quote from the book. a hyena, a zebra, and an orangutan. They all land on a lifeboat, and because of the tiger's presence on the lifeboat, Piscine has to move to a raft lying nearby and attach it with the boat. So a surreal situation in which Piscine has to share his only life support, the boat, and cross the Pacific Ocean. So it actually puts Piscine in the category of not the boat people, but in the category of raft people. Okay, and the book reads like not a road movie, but more like an ocean movie, sorry, an ocean book as compared to a road book. So Piscine's sea adventure ends when he lands in the Mexican territory. Okay, so he's going to Canada and lands in Mexican territory, and because of this whole situation. So it slightly reminds of what was said in this morning. Okay, he drifts, mm, uh, and where he narrates his account to the Japanese ship investigators who are actually investigating the insurance claim, and who are not willing to believe his account, which is actually a stark reminder of so many survivors, so be it Holocaust or genocide. When they came back, they were not believed. I mean, the horrors were not believed in. So as many historical accounts has revealed, survivors have to live with a trauma of having survived while others were perishing. So Piscine bears the death of his people and his animals on his conscience. And here, in this case, literature through imagination and artistic creativity perhaps managed to fill the gap left by the absence of a real victim, encompassing thereby a reality that could otherwise be lost, as Primo Levi insinuated in his Drowned and the Sound, that there cannot be a real witness account of a victim because the victim has actually perished. So through this presentation, so he was definitely referring to, Levi was definitely referring to Auschwitz gas chambers victims. So through this presentation, I'm going to perhaps foreground the role of literary fiction in underlining the despair and trauma associated to the loss, appearing in the form of dead bodies in the middle of nowhere, the place which we can also call an ocean. And then I'll also emphasize on the representation of an even bigger tragedy, that is a survivor's predicament of mourning those personal losses and concurrently overlooking them in order to concentrate on a survival in real time. So with his Life of Pi and later on a follow-up, a book called Beatrice and Virgile, uh, Jan Martel underlines the role of fiction in the vast ocean of witness accounts that falls under the category of fiction. So another important aspect of the novel is that it's quite avant-garde, as you know, it captures the death in ocean much before the real horrors start appearing in popular media and on social media. So mainly the case in Lampedusa in the Mediterranean Sea. So does fiction undermines non-fiction? I mean, this has been a debate all the time. So the writer appears to have a double aim of engaging in literal terms, sorry, the reader with the ordeal of the survivor and the victim, and to make him deal with the fragmented account of the survivor, precisely because it becomes a part of the aesthetics of memory, shaped not only by what was really lived, but also by the trauma that was lived during the journey. So, and similarly, in her Boat People, a novel by Sharon Bala, it addresses the nature of trauma of war refugees trying to prove their innocence and their non-cooperation in war, neither as soldier nor as militant, one of the major criteria to make them eligible for demanding a refugee status. In Life of Pi, Piscine is not confronted with such tribulations. Yet the common denominator remains the fact that Bala's refugees and Martin's Piscine are expected to speak and to speak up. Before claiming a refugee status, a victim or survivor's status need to be claimed. A refugee's demeanor is ascertained in order to see whether he or she can be a good refugee or not. Piscine goes through this demeanor test towards the end of the novel, where he is expected to narrate a straightforward account emanating from his role of a shipwreck victim. And then to the Japanese ship investigator. And what he does instead is invent a story, or rather, two of them. One version is apparently reserved for the reader, and another one for the both the reader and the investigators toward the end of the novel. So, can one narrate in a linear manner after having experienced a traumatic experience? Uh, the novel's narrative strategy also lies on the primacy of Precine's soliloquy that lasts almost till the end of the novel, that gives the impression that the vast ocean is a theater. His imminent spectators are mute animals who would not speak, and readers who could not speak with Pi. So this strategy helps also in underlining the overbearing solitude of the survivor, since he's speaking all alone. And at the same time, his account remains untallied as there is no other survivor. In fact, according to be seen, the sole other survivor, the Bengal tiger, conveniently leaves his company at his arrival on the Mexican beach, never to be found again. So the reader also delves into the psychological condition of the main protagonist. Piscin is handed over the agency on his current situation or his narratives. Paradoxically, because it's a paradox because he never actually had any agency on his situation. He never chose to be a victim in the first place. The reader is under the obligation to believe his fairy tale narratives. Traveling in an ocean on a wooden raft for more than 7 months in the company of a Bengal tiger and discovering elements that almost appear like fantasy, it appears that trauma may lead to a creation or a recreation of one story. A similar narrative strategy appeared in a movie called Train of Life by Radu Mihai, in which the lead character creates a hilarious tale of their escape from Nazi invasion of the village, which was also a tragicomedy and a road movie, or rather a track movie, as most of the action takes place on a train journey. So as opposed to 15 years old Piscine, the audience watched Train of Life through the eyes of a town lunatic. The common denominator in both movies uh, and the novel being the innocence of the narrator and their ability to create a story for themselves in order to survive the trauma. So another common element could be the use of humor in case of Piscine, which actually makes the story both incredible and non-credible. Uh, so there is this survival guide. I just copied it from the book. Okay, and this is actually a real piece of document. So this survival guide reads like a gallows humor in the middle of the ocean. As such, it's not humoristic, but if you read it in the middle of the novel, where actually he's trying to survive and he comes across this British survival guide, it actually reads like a novel, and actually it reminds me of what was said in the morning. You see, just look at the first point: do not drink urine or seawater or bird blood. Uh, this document actually P remembers it by heart, and it actually makes him a comment on a small childhood trauma that he had lived. That was actually, his name was Spy, but since it was a short variation or a diminutive of Piscine, people called him Piss. His classmates called him Piss, and he had to give a whole lesson to them that it's not actually Piss, it's not actually P as Piss, it's actually Pi as the theorem pi. So, so the narrative sense of humor usually comes to an end with the bouts of rational, also leading to a hopelessness. So, for example, he comes just immediately after this thing. He comes, a castaway's worst mistake is to hope too much and to do little. Kind of. This is like his rationale. The ship named Simpson, I don't pronounce it very well, on which the whole family is traveling with their animals from the Pondicherry Zoo, takes its inspiration from the biblical myth of Noah's Ark. Okay, because there is a family carrying animals and all this thing. So, and it also results in the creation of two different narratives, with one being having a predominantly animal characters, and the other one with human beings at the core of the narration. So we thereby come across a development of a new type of ecosystem with animals, humans, and fish all becoming a part of the same story, as if the writer were telling us that there cannot be a survival story emanating from the sea or the ocean that does not have other type of characters than just human beings. Uh, Pi had imposed upon himself a religious shroud. That was before the shipwreck happened. He had visited all the possible religious places for praying and even started calling atheism as just another form of religion. This was again his life prior to this thing, and this religious cloak started showing wear and tear when he's confronted with the reality of a survivor. He eats raw fish, well, actually, which was against his belief. He was he turned to be vegetarian. He eats raw fish, turtles, and even dolphins by killing them with his own hands. The religious dimension plays a vital role in most of the survival tales. So Charlotte Innes, who studied this book as well, refers to this novel as, I quote, a religious book that addresses to a non-religious person, and which also has a reminiscent of the novel that once, like Judith suggested me, and it was, and I read it after that. It was called Goat Days. So it was written by Benjamin, a Malayali writer, and in which it's again a first person account of a migrant. And so Benjamin and Piscine in these novels revive the attraction towards a religious dimension in the middle of the tragedy. The proverbial dichotomy between religion and rational outside the parameters of tragedy appears to blur during a tragedy that had certainly occurred to a human error. The religious dimension, its absence toward the middle of the story, the use of humor are the elements that Janet Reno would call a healing process in his or her story. Piscine, after a bout of religious flirtation with gods from all religions that are available in India, had been living quiet life with his parents. So here he discovers a new way of treating the tragedy that has befallen him in the ocean: story creation. Although it takes him far away from his metaphysical belief system that he previously had, he discovers, like Max Schulz, a character in Nazi and the Barber by Edgar Hisnat, that God remains unavailable in the time of life-threatening crisis. It brings him closer to an intellectual exercise that allows him to delve into reality of the situation. Uh, so he loses, as I said previously, his innocence. And and even before the shipwreck, now let's talk about the pragmatic aspect of the present in the novel. Even before the shipwreck happened, Piscine had realized that this journey would not be that of a traveler. I quote, the ship was no luxury liner. It was a grimy, hard-working cargo ship not designed for paying passengers or for their comfort. Another uncomfortable element that points towards the perilous nature of the journey is that Piscine and his brother had been aware of the perils they were running by being on that ship. I quote, something was wrong with the engines, he said. Did something go wrong with the fixing of them? I don't know. I don't think anyone will ever know. The answer is a mystery lying at the bottom of thousands of feet of water. So Simpson was bound to sink right from the beginning. Moreover, the ship had a Panama flag, and according to a BBC maritime report, uh, Panama ships registered, no matter the country to which they belong, the ships that are registered in Panama, I mean, for tax evasion and for all these things, they usually have their fitness certificates bought in the market. So they're not actually fit for uh, they're not always fit for doing such a big journey. So as a migrant, the tragedy becomes more poignant as he didn't choose it. So the fictionality of the novel appears on many levels, and it appears that almost as if the writer Martel had not done his homework before writing the novel. So Martel has chosen a surname Patel for a guy living in South India. Well, it's not impossible, but mainly it's a more prominent name in the western part of India. And from all accounts, Pondicherry never had a zoo. It never possessed a zoo. Piscine uses miles and pounds as measures, whereas it is predominantly the metric system that is used in India. We use kilometers and kilograms. His maternal uncle, his Mamaji, has got two passports, Indian and French, which is impossible. Okay, even today it's impossible. Uh, so, uh, so moreover, in the 70s, if I'm not wrong, the UK and the USA were the main destination for immigrants traveling from India because of some Canadian laws. The ship sinks, and along with sinks his innocence. So it could also be read as a coming of age novel. So his life is also a proof that there are challenges to be faced. As a matter of fact, the immediate survival merely separates the survivor from a victim. The trauma that comes along with the guilt of having survived, as it was the case with Mahindan in the Boat People, builds up on the reality in which loss becomes a reality of their day-to-day life, and their survivals become even a bigger necessity in a face of tragedy. So as Piscine sees it as a child, he was never willing to leave the country. So I mean, he could have stayed back in the country. The decision was reached at a drop of hat due to the upcoming sufferings and due to the fact that they had time and resources to flee the country. Uh, this aspect of the novel highlights the horrific dimension of surviving. It is mainly those people who manage to flee and probably survive who can obtain means for doing that. So it's not within the reach of everyone. Similarly, in the Boat People, Mahindan was required to sell everything, his jewelry and everything. But the idea was he had resources to escape his country. I mean, the people who did not have, they had to live back and die. Uh, so Pie's story further reveals another darker peril that puts into test the very notion of humanity, which is defined by Cambridge as all people. So it includes, it excludes animals. So it uh, uh, so, for example, Primo Levi, similar to this novel, underlines the predicament of a survivor in a very first survival account novel called "If This Is the Man." No, sorry, it's not there. The title raises question over the existence of putative elements of humanity or towards prevalence or even existence of humanity while facing a near-death experience, humanity that is supposed to be a pillar on which respect and goodness are based. So, Pai's trauma stems from the loss of his family that was on board with him. However, most of his immediate bereavement period is marked by his attempt to keep himself alive. In the story number one, from a predator, the Bengal tiger, and in his story number two, from the French cook who has turned cannibalistic and from hungers and tiredness. I quote, I was no longer crying because of my family or because of my impending death. I was far too numb to consider either. I was crying because I was exceedingly tired and it was time to get rest. So this idea is, yeah.
Apologies. 3 minutes left.
Okay, 3 minutes, perfect. So this somehow this also echoes in Levy's account when he says that because of the constant imminence of death, there was no time to concentrate on the idea of death. So, uh, so now what happened? Since uh, so all this notion of creating and recreating story, it brings us to a point where we start asking ourselves, is he not just the survivor of a shipwreck running from a war or from a genocide, who just created a story of a zoo in Pondicherry that had never existed, and of his Indian maternal uncle holding two passports, and started talking to his Canadian reader and the post-destruction host in the language that the latter understood, using miles instead of kilometers and pounds instead of kilos, a creation that also reminds us of George Perrec's novel, which is called W in French and W as W, double life, okay? Uh, or the movie Train of Life, as I previously mentioned. So this healing process is also in function over here when they are creating this whole story. So in an interesting quote, P replies to his Japanese ship insurance, doesn't the telling of something always becomes a story, when he's asked by them not to narrate a story but to give a straightforward account of what happened, echoing what Levy had said regarding his own memory. This book is drenched in memory. It draws from a suspect source and must be protected against itself. So in order to conclude, I would just quickly say that, so while Levy was using allegories of shipwreck in his, in his book Drowned and The Drowned and the Saved, Martel uses allegorical elements from like Simpson, which is a Hebraic word, which means uh, uh, absence, sorry, presence through the absence of God. And the tiger that we see in the picture, we come to know that it was the alter ego of Pi. Okay, so which actually gives us the impression that only the survival of the fittest is possible, as he killed the other people. So the people he killed was one of the person was chosen as a French cook. So again, this is a kind of a obsession of Jan Martel with the Holocaust story, because the cook is not a French as a matter of chance, because it's a French cook. It allows the author to give to have a historical link with the story, basically with the Second World War. The mother calls him, "You monster, you animal, how could you? He's a human, he's your own kind," pointing towards the French implication, perhaps, in Holocaust. And in his own interview to Ruth Franklin, Jan Martel said, "The idea of turning around and killing your friends, neighbors, the Holocaust stayed in my mind as a surreal oddity right from his youth." So with his Life of Pi and Beatrice and Virgil, Martel keeps on experimenting with literature on survivors and bringing the debate to the fore, whether literary tools like allegories and personalization of animals can be accepted to depict the tragedy of survivors. Thank you.
Can you see that now? Yeah, good. So, okay, we're ready to go. Just as a coder, I'd just like to say that I think it's a very strange thing to write about your PhD student. And I did this. I did it just because there was nothing else I wanted to write about. And it's a strange moment that I had to kind of deal with some kind of ethical issues, but I just gave up on the ethical issues and just did it anyway. It's stunning work. And the other thing to say about it, I think, it's about, for me, it's about bodies disremembered in British history. So, and some of these bodies are at the bottom of the ocean, but a lot of them are just utterly forgotten. So they live their lives and they're now forgotten in British history, and we're trying to, Jade in particular, is trying to bring those bodies back and those people back. Clay is a beautiful, our landscape is its own monument. Its meaning can only be traced on the underside. It is all history. Edouard Glissant from Caribbean Discourse. Clay, 2015, is a beautiful, elegiac and haunting 10-minute film made with great sensitivity by Caitlin and Andrew Webb Ellis. It depicts a simple act. A naked black woman digs with her bare hands in the clay earth of North Yorkshire to the sounds of natural silence, interrupted by distant birdsong. She's alone in the landscape, and her isolation seems total. The experience is constructed as bleak, remote, unforgiving, unhearing, without union or unity with other bodies. As she excavates, her body is covered in the wet clay she digs. Her hair, her face, her limbs, her buttocks, her stomach, her breasts all become a slimy mess. She immerses herself in the land literally and figuratively. There are close-ups of this process that emphasize the labour involved in dirty work and the bodily efforts required to do the work, referencing a whole history of black bodies' physical efforts for little tangible personal reward. There are long shots too of the figure in what is becoming a pit, digging, surrounded by acres of empty land. Her lonely, isolated status in the harsh environment is exacerbated by these shots. As she extracts the wet earth, she piles it so that it resembles the walls of a shelter, almost as though she is dry stone walling, a common Yorkshire means of enclosing land. Has she created a burial pit, a shelter, or a wall, or all three? Is she a gravedigger, a craftsperson, or a putative homemaker? She is all three, expressing mourning for black lives lost through the history of slavery and its aftermath, creating new other lives in alien worlds, and finally making homes. The multiplicity of the film is central to its powerful meaning, in which the artist and performer Jade Montserrat seeks to articulate her claim to this alien British rural space as a black woman. In this, she consciously dialogizes black histories with the narratives of other groups, such as working class rural labourers, whose work on the land is so often minimised by processes of elision, similar to those used against black presence. And we can see this in the history of British literature, culture and art. Think of the novels of Bronte and the kind of working class experience which is marginalised there. You could particularly see it actually in the film of Wuthering Heights, the contemporary film of Wuthering Heights, which sees Heathcliff as a black man. And when Montserrat talks about her work, she often invokes the Brontes, who come from a place within 50 miles of her. Her process illuminates a multi-directional memorialization that Michael Rothberg has posited as a way of describing the intersections of vernacular memories that are too often bifurcated. Memories, he says, are not owned by groups, nor are groups owned by memories. Rather, the borders of memory and identity are jagged. What at first looks like my own property often turns out to be a borrowing or adaptation from history that might seem foreign or distant. Memory is anachronistic quality. It's bringing together of now and then, here and there, is actually the source of its powerful creativity, its ability to build new worlds out of the materials of old ones. It's memory's anachronistic quality that Montserrat feeds off in this work, summoning ghosts from the past, from here and now, and from there and then, routed across nations and continents, all memorialized in the clay earth of her alien home space. The elemental nature of the work, getting down and dirty in the very clay that in many African and diasporic myths of origin births humanity itself, aligns the work with deep time as well as recent history. Montserrat's praxis, with its summoning of such deep time narratives, allies her with an environmentalist poetics and politics, as discussed by Tom Griffiths. Deep time, he says, and social history seem to be antitheses of one another, each operating on utterly different timescales and subject matters. One conjures up ancient evolutionary history, even a non-human world, while the other suggests the study of modern society. One deals in awesome geological eras, while the other takes its chronological scale from a human lifespan. It is one of the challenges to connect them, to work audaciously across time, as well as across race and species. As well as its relation to such elemental stories, and thus its links to deep time, the work crucially nuances our understanding of Black British history and of Black Atlantic history through its intersections with local histories and memories. And Montserrat's praxis in her work echoes Rothberg's and Griffiths' theoretical ideas on multi-directional memorization and environmental politics. Her emotional attachment to and care for local space links her to other artists working with landscape. As Yvonne Reddick, in describing the poetry of my late wife, Elizabeth Burns, says, art that responds to nature nowadays has one foot planted in the local, while the other feels for a foothold in the world that is increasingly marked by migration and global environmental issues. It deepens our connection to the place where we live and sharpens our knowledge of how the environment is wider and wilder than our home turf. Simultaneously, local and global concerns are figured in Montserrat's art of landscape. She undertakes what I describe elsewhere as a guerrilla memorialization in this Yorkshire clay, intervening in that hitherto designated white rural environment to posit its link to Black lives historically and now. Montserrat's digging, making artwork resembling a grave, is redolent of mourning for those lives lost and forgotten, and a reinscription of them in the historical record. In this, she could be said to be engaging in a ritual, what Paul Ricoeur has described in his monumental work, Memory, History, Forgetting, as performing an act of memorialization struck through with the power of burial rites. He says sepulchre, indeed, is not only a place set apart in our cities, the place we call a cemetery, in which we depose the remains of the living who return to dust. It is an act, the act of burying. This gesture is not punctual. It's not limited to the moment of burial. This, the sepulchre remains because the gesture of burying remains. Its path is the very path of mourning that transforms the physical absence of the lost subject into an inner presence. The sepulchre as the material place thus becomes the enduring mark of mourning, the memory aid of the act, the sepulchre. This transformation of the physical absence of the lost object into an inner presence is crucial to an understanding of Montserrat's work as an act of recovery of Black lives marginalised, killed and forgotten in this landscape and beyond. Likewise, the act of digging into the earth to construct a grave-like pit is a ritualised guerrilla memorialisation that works against melancholic forgetfulness. She makes a mark of mourning for those for whom there had been no previous recognition. And I'd just like to contrast this to Ingrid Pollard's Pastoral Interlude, because that work is a work of a metropolitan artist going into the countryside. It's very fine work, and she's in the Lake District, showing the alienation of Black figures in the Lake District. But what Montserrat's doing in comparison is showing that these places are home spaces for Black people as well. Edouard Glissant has talked about enslaved Africans and their descendants' relationships to the alien lands they inhabit. The land of suffering, he says, is abandoned. The land is not yet loved. The land is the other's possession. The poetics of the land cannot then be a poetics of thrift, of patient repossession, of anticipation. It is a poetics of excess, where all is exhausted immediately. We expose the landscape to these various kinds of madness that they have put on us. Exiled from diasporic homelands, Montserrat finds this British landscape, although very familiar, to be problematic. But her reaction is to work through this dilemma of alienation by literally attaching herself to it. Montserrat exposes the land to the madness, to her madness of frantic digging and naked exuberance, as this dreamlike space of bucolic life she has inhabited, this North Yorkshire rural environment, needs this act of solemn reclamation to truly become hers. It's almost as though she has to dig into the land to move away from its bucolic nature, to dig into the land, into the dirt, into the mud, to say no to bucolism, to say no to the bucolic nature of this environment, or to problematize that bucolic nature. It is the very locality of the place, its importance to her personally, that enables the power of the art. As Lucy Lippard reminds us, the intersection of nature, culture, history and ideology form the ground on which we stand. Our land, our place, the local, the lure of the local is the pull of the place that operates on all of us, exposing our politics and our spiritual legacies. This claiming of rural northern space is vital because of Montserrat's experience of unbelonging, caused by current racism that denies her rights in the present day home space. As Claudette Johnson has said, the horrors of slavery and racism have left us with the knowledge that every aspect of our existence is open to abuse. This is reinforced by the experience of a kind of social and cultural invisibility. It is to counter this loss of a sense of ownership of both land and body that Montserrat creates a dynamic performance of her body working its way into ownership of the land she inhabits. Despite her claims to ownership, she's a vagrant, vagabond presence in a landscape owned by aristocratic masters. She filmed clay on land that she's lived on most of her life, but that is a private shooting estate. And to an extent, I wanted to show you next Lubaina Himid's Naming the Money, to sort of contrast the kind of different ways that Black artists have to talk about alienation and diaspora. And this work talks to those bodies that came across as slave servants in the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th century, and how these bodies, she provides them with lives apart from their lives as slave servants and shows these lives going onwards. The elision of Black people in the landscape has led some theorists to describe African diasporic historical presence as spectral. Ian Balcom theorizes that absence thus: if the general task of what I'm calling the testamentary melancholy realist counter-discourse of modernity is to recover the lost, to acknowledge and take some effective property in the ruinous past, continuously, if non-synchronously present within now being, then the particular task of an interested cosmopolitanism is not merely to make the past present, but to render the unseen visible, to bear witness to the truth of what has not been and cannot have been witnessed. Montserrat's recovery of the lost history of Black presence renders this unseen population visible despite their elision from most historical narratives. She literally makes the past present by reinserting the Black body in the frame. She is interested in upturning the legacy of this elision of past Black histories in these northern environs, and the consequent amnesia which creates a vacuum where Black people once lived, walked and laboured. She wants to give flesh to what have been ghostly, spectral voices and images. Here are the ghostly, spectral voices and imagery. Runaway from Dent in Yorkshire on Monday the 18th of August 1758. Thomas Anson, a Negro man, etc., etc. These are runaway slave narratives brought together in 2018. So these lives were not even necessarily out there when Montserrat created her piece in 2015, but her piece was already speaking to them. On the other side of Yorkshire from Scarborough, miles across the moors, an African slave is here shown to have absconded from his master's home in an isolated part of the country. He would have walked rural Yorkshire as an escaped slave, as Montserrat was to do 250 years later, but he's a fugitive seeking to escape the shackles. And here in Lancashire too, in the semi-rural north in Heysham, an Ibu boy runs away with African scarification marks. And look at this, he speaks broad Lancashire dialect. I think this is the first instance, written instance, of a Black man speaking in broad Lancashire dialect. Only came to light in 2018, and is owned by a reverend, by a church minister. I can go on a lot about this. For time, I'll not go on about it now, but you can ask questions about it in the question time. But the important thing is that she is bringing back to life these individuals who have been forgotten by history right up until the present time, and only just being remembered. The vagrant, vagabond nature of slave runaways can be illuminated and exemplified by Peat Bog, a companion video performance piece to Clay made by Montserrat. Running through a landscape of peat bogs, a clothed Montserrat is filmed with lengthy close-ups of her feet in the muddy watercourses, showing her lovingly at home in this boggy landscape and joyfully emancipated. Extended.
Alan, apologies. Yes, about 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
Shots of her feet indicate the long distance fugitive feet will need to travel, as well as the deep connection of those feet to the North British landscape. And here in toes, the words say you'll have to be on your toes to survive these parts. This is an amazing piece. I could actually show you the real one because it's downstairs in my front room, but I decided not to have that boast. But as you can see, it's an amazing piece which has embedded in the feet the kind of deep time of a different place. I say Africa, she says Asia, she says these are Buddhist, they're based on Buddhist sculptures. I think they're more general than that, but me and Jade can have that argument. But Toes shows her embedded in this Yorkshire earth, but taking with her the her African roots. So then, in a piece called "No Need for Clothing," she goes even further, taking the texts which she works with into the art galleries, and she uses charcoal. And she uses charcoal for a very specific reason, which is that the charcoal is contagious, that people who go to this exhibit end up with charcoal on their bodies, as she has charcoal on her bodies as she makes it. I'll just end with the final. The drawing material leaves a trace on the audience. So they're implicated. If they come to see the work, they become part of the work quite naturally, because the carbon is already in the air. They're going to be absorbing it. The drawing is also located in the choreography of the body around the space. So there are layers of a kind of drawing. Some will leave material traces, some will leave traces of memory. So what this work talks to is the charcoal performs a function as a trace that cannot be elided, like the Black history it symbolises. One of the textures graffitied on the wall of the galleries and made into watercolour that she called Hair is exemplary. It states, her hair, like history's, flattened, ironed and creased. So flattened, ironed and erased. Her hair, like history's, flattened, ironed and erased. And I've got the last 4 or 5 sentences. Montserrat's whole praxis works against this distortion and erasure of Black history. In his discussion of the archive and testimony, Giorgio Agamben posits how what we have left stands in for what is lost, and charcoal and its contagion is Montserrat's remnant. Agamben describes how in the end the remnant appears as a redemptive machine, allowing for the salvation of the very whole, whose division and loss it had signified. Montserrat's praxis here, like that in clay, labours and works through a messy physicality that is as much part of the artwork as the finished piece. Her redemptive machine seeks to restore a lost Black history, deals with the horrors of present racial realities, and posits new Black futures through collaborative political actions symbolised by her contagious praxis. Thank you.